So, dear colleagues, I'm happy to see and to present to you Dr. Ignacio Quepons, who is director of Instituto of Philosophy at Veracruz University in Mexico. Dr. Quepons' thesis was on affectivity in Husserlian phenomenology. He also published extensively on phenomenology of values and phenomenology of emotions. And today's talk will be on feeling vulnerable, phenomenological dimensions of affectivity. Dr. Quepons, please start.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I am very pleased and thankful for this opportunity to sharing my work with all of you. And well, it is like in Russia. I mean, in a way, I am speaking in Moscow through this virtual environments. So I am very happy for sharing this work. This is part of my current research on a phenomenology of vulnerability. And well, first of all, I also have to say that I cannot start before expressing my concern about the current and horrid events in Ukraine, and hopefully the message I want to send to all of you is a message of peace and solidarity, especially with the Russian scholars which are isolated because of this situation, and of course to my dear colleagues in Ukraine, which are like suffering this horrid situation. Well, my talk is about vulnerability. This is a part of a bigger project. May I share the screen, please? So perhaps
I will give you
no, it's okay.
I will make you organizer of the event, okay, and then you will project.
Perfect. Yeah, it is just because perhaps I won't read the entire thing, but it is easier because of my horrid accent to follow perhaps this the text. So I won't read the entire thing. This is a part of the book I am like working on now. Okay, where is the text? Okay, here. So, and well, the following analysis I am like presenting today is a description of the way we are aware of our vulnerability, and emphasizing how this awareness of vulnerability is correlative to the development of the structures of experience connected to the constitution of our sense of axiological orientation. And in the other hand, I will claim that it is possible to trace such genesis in the constitutive horizons of the lived body. If we consider the experience that allows us to reflect not only upon what we already have as valuable in a more or less immediate and unreflective form, but also upon the sense of our normativity and the justification of our value in position takings, we find the roots of such experiences in the way we consciously cope with the vulnerability of our lived body and our practical aims, beginning with the impulses of self-motivated movement and continuing to the formation of personal projects, especially given the possibility of failure and undergoing irreversible harm and as a consequence. In this regard, we can summarize some methodological presuppositions orienting this investigation before presenting the entire description of this awareness or feeling vulnerable. The anticipation of affective infliction or harm that conforms the field of possible affectations implied in the awareness of vulnerability presupposes at least two conditions. First, it presupposes an understanding of vulnerability as an experience of the sudden limitation of the primitive or primal capability of self-motivated movement, which is experienced as the frustration of an intentional practical synthesis. According to Husserl, the basic practical potentiality that precedes any other form of I can is the I move. And second, in its primitive or primal dimension, vulnerability is experienced not only with regard to the sudden deprivation of the capability of self-motivated movement, along with its affective consequences, but as one of the horizons of the non-objective dimension of lived body and its relation with the axiological constitution of the self. On the other hand, from the point of view of a genetic phenomenological analysis, it is possible to suggest that the consciousness of vulnerability not only refers to the external horizon that limits the free flow of self-motivated movement, along with the affective distress that results from disappointments with regard to practical aims in the life world, but is one of the horizons of latency of values and practical goals, especially in the case of the so-called absolute or personal values in the context of Husserlian phenomenology. The potential for harm that is in the basis for the sense of vulnerability not only anticipates the negative fulfillment of a practical intentionality implied in the tendency of self-motivated movement, but discloses a deep dimension of intimacy that, according to this hypothesis, lies at the very core of what Husserl calls personal or absolute value. In this way, we can summarize our assumptions as follows. At the lower level of constitution bodily vulnerability, we have the possibility of getting hurt, or better to say, wounded. In a higher level, we may speak of a normative dimension of vulnerability, where getting hurt or wounded is not only the corporeal affliction, but a higher level of experiencing a breakdown, given either as the possibility of a negative fulfillment of a practical aim, or as the possibility of experiencing suffering as a consequence not only of the intercorporeal interaction, but of oppressive situations in social interactions. Such normative dimension is rooted in the constitutive and practical dynamics of embodiment, which allows to explain the structures of experience of values, starting from the sensible values to the spiritual values, especially the personal values. This is something is very important for me. Actually, this phenomenology of vulnerability is connected to a more, so to speak, technical current research I am working on now, which is the attempt at presenting a genetic account of axiology of values in the context of Husserlian phenomenology, in order to bring into consideration a more concrete access to this dimension, this more technical research project. I started presented on or working on the experience of vulnerability, because what I want to show is how is connected this more sensible and more sensible and bodily experience of values with the so-called spiritual or personal values and so on. But also, what is important in my account in this regard, I am not precisely taking distance from Husserl, but in a way I am taking distance of his positive or his emphasis in the positive account of values, because from my point of view, and in a way inspired by the Mexican phenomenologist Luis Villoro, I prefer to emphasize the negative access to values, which in this case is the reason I am emphasizing the experience of vulnerability. So I speaking about a little bit more about this negative account of values in a further level of critical analysis, taking as inspiration the work of Luis Villoro and switching the perspective of transcendental phenomenology into a more critical reorientation of the phenomenological self-beziehung, we suggest the possibility of a reorientation of this self-examination, self-beziehung, from a mere descriptive experience into a more understanding of such self-reflection as a critical reflexive praxis, in order to give account of the affective sources of normativity involved in the condition of vulnerability, which is emphasizing lacking of what we value or appreciate, or the experience of getting rid of what we more appreciate, what is more important for us. Well, so in order to outline some relevant aspects of a preliminary phenomenological account of the phenomenon of vulnerability, I will start describing how the sense of vulnerability arises with regard to the practical horizons of embodiment. Then after, I will point out the relevance of a phenomenological account of moods, presenting a critical revision of Heidegger's description of fear with regard to harmfulness in order to specify the locations of, so to speak, of the phenomenon of vulnerability. And by following Heidegger's description of fear, it is possible, I will claim that it is possible to address this experiential dimension of the correlation between fear and harmfulness and the particular sense of being exposed to harm that belongs to vulnerability. And well, beyond the circumstantial predicate of fragility and damage, we will see how this part works. Oh my God, what's going on here? Oh, where's my text? Let me see what is happening here. Oh my God. Oops. Where is my text? Hold a second, please. Oh my God, I'm having a very bad technical problem here. I'm stopping a little bit. So, well, I was in this part regarding Heidegger. So this is the second part of my exploration belongs to the examination of Heidegger and correlation between fear and harmfulness. Then after, I will mention how phenomenologists like Ludwig Landgrebe emphasize the corporeality in this context, following a little bit a bridge between Husserl and Heidegger, and these horizons of these practical horizons, how these practical horizons are connected with the analysis of Dasein that Heidegger is performing. So I will mention how Landgrebe could connect the descriptions of Heidegger to our more Husserlian account of the experience of embodiment and the practical horizons of embodiment. And at the end, I will also just mention this the possibility of a more positive, in a way, positive account of vulnerability, following in a way Husserl and also the way opened by Emmanuel Levinas, who, in contradiction to both Husserl and Heidegger, opens up the possibility of reframing the balance of vulnerability and considering it not only as something positive, but also constitutive and essential to the configuration of the ethical meaning of what we are. And right at the end, I will also mention a little bit how Villoro account of what he calls the negative way into justice is connected with, or opens a perspective of how the awareness and the analysis of vulnerability may allows us to understand possible understanding of the experience of values, and also how we can reframe this the project of the axiology in the Husserlian transcendental phenomenology into a more critical orientation. Well, let's start then with the concept of vulnerability. It is possible to understand vulnerability in a broad sense as a circumstantial disposition expressed in the form of an accidental predicate relative to the interaction between that which is to be considered vulnerable because it can be harmfully affected, and that which is able to harm it. Nevertheless, the meaning of vulnerability does not necessarily correspond to the mere physical fragility, nor to the possibility of undergoing damage. Instead, it is possible that its primal meaning lies in the possibility of being wounded or harmed, which involves an affective dimension of experience. More specifically, however, our experience of realization of vulnerability appears in essential correlation to encountering the harmful. In this regard, and in contradistinction to the notion of harm as physical damage to the physical fragility, harm in the context of vulnerability seems to be a dynamic notion that could perhaps be understood as with regard to frustration of the continuity of an ongoing process of experiencing, resulting in a deprivation or decrease of practical capabilities. This is very important in my account. Given that the most original potentiality of the lived body, as I already mentioned it before, is the self-motivated movement, we may refer to vulnerability as the horizon of the anticipation of being subject to being suddenly and almost always painfully deprived of a practical potentiality, beginning with the potentiality of self-movement, but also going up to other practical potentialities. Thus, the practical horizon of as yet indeterminate determinations of such disruptions pertaining to experience and consequences correspond to what we may call the dimension of what we feel within this sphere of practical possibilities as harmful. Vulnerability then emerges as the dimension in which what is understood as harmful reveals a sense of intimate fragility that may still involve being physically exposed to damage, but especially concerned with the eventual frustration or decrease of these practical capabilities. Well, let me go a little bit further. Then I want to perhaps present how this horizons, body of horizons of vulnerability works. According to Husserl, the concrete and fullest sense of which we may understand subjectivity, or in his words, the monad, is a dynamic unity of the stream of consciousness and the progressive constitution of his or her own corporeality with regard to the surrounding world. Such constitution, I'm not sure if I am still sharing okay, I wasn't. So such constitution presupposes two levels that it is possible to analyze according to the constitutive analysis involved in each field of experience. On one hand, we have the constitution of corporeality, understood as a field of sensitive affectations and kinesthetic activities developed on several forms of potentialities to actualities, the so-called lived body, life. And in the other hand, we have the material or physical dimension of corporeality, the corporeal lived body, which is the result of the constitutive synthesis of physical interactions and causality. In either case, the core of the constitution of the materiality of one's own corporeal body, there is a motivational synthesis consistent with the progressive agency over the body I own. However, such command over my own body does not mean that the body is given as if it were something independent or distant from my will. On the contrary, embodiment is the very expression of my will. The primordial dimension of all practical capabilities consists in the preeminence of the potentiality I move over the potentiality I can, which allows us to consider the relevance of corporeality in the configuration of other practical potentialities in general. Thus, the body is our very means of practical access to the surrounding world, since embodiment is constituted by synthesis of motivation unified by the preeminent potentiality of self-movement. The increase of my sense of control over the movement possibilities at my disposal, and thus over my corporeal lived body, results in the development of a series of habitualities configuring, on the one hand, a personal style of being, who I am with regard to the way I am oriented myself to the multifacetious display of my perceptual world. On the other hand, such progressive development of an optimal control over my body, allowing perceptual objects to come to optimal givenness, entails the formation of a sense of normality and familiarity with the environment, resulting in the sense of comfort and security. In other words, under the label familiarity, we should consider both normality of perception and the emergency of an axiological dimension of a pre-reflexive sense of normativity, namely the feeling of being at home, for instance. Here, my lived body, bodily habitualities in their interaction with my physical body, which follows its own synthetic process, have their role in the configuration in different stages of constitutions of the progressive development of a stable surrounding horizon of other objects and their regularities of their respective behaviors. Therefore, both the constitution of my personal style of inhabiting my corporeality and the display of physical interaction developing the perceptual field of the surrounding world, the kinesthetic synthesis involved in both processes runs in two different directions. On the one hand, in a more like static phenomenological terms, we have that the sensible synthesis of self-motivated movement is the constitutive condition for the progressive exhibition of physical objects, along with their perceptual features, through adumbration, including cases where the perceptual object is my physical body. But on the other hand, in a more genetic orientation, we also may consider that such a progressive exhibition of the objects of perception presupposes the acquisition of synthesis of the unity of the lived body in its primal potentiality. Self-movement has already been accomplished. Moreover, sensitive affectation arising in the exhibition through self-movement of own physical bodies are intertwined with explicit affective or emotive sensations that are already experienced as the result of passive synthesis of motivation, linking the excitement of sensations with the awakening of an active disposition we may understand following Latgrave as the expression of the way we encounter ourselves in the world. Thus, since sensibility entails in a genetic perspective a primitive form of intentional direction synthesized by the self-motivated movement of the body, the primal exhibition of the surrounding world already involves a meaning or balance that results in further levels of constitution. Well, I am like presenting all the positive, so to speak, the positive account of our bodily interaction with the surrounding world. What happens in the context of vulnerability? Well, vulnerability, what I am like trying to emphasize is that vulnerability refers to the constitutive sense of localized individuation of myself in the world disclosed as possibilities. However, this dimension of nature reveals my own body and the surrounding environment in a material dimension of otherness manifested in bare materiality of my affectivity. As such, for instance, the experience of pain. Here, instead of revealing itself as an absolute here, the body becomes the absolute there, following Saulus Genius's in this regard, where I am firmly fixed to the natural world. Therefore, since vulnerability is a situational phenomenon, it's opened not only through the motivational nexus and its temporal structure, but also through spatial horizons, then it is not only the specific place where I am, but the very condition of this spatial constitution, namely embodiment, that from its very origin makes me vulnerable. The field of experience is not a mere exhibition of correlates of acts of perception, but a play field, Spielraum, for performances of the free flow of lived body movement that perceptual activity presupposes. However, such play field does not always appear as an open field of my freely motivated movement. Instead, another original mode of its manifestation is exactly the opposite, resisting my movement, sometimes with harmful consequences, namely my vulnerability. So I want to go a little bit further into this account of Heidegger, how Heidegger comes into consideration. So I started describing the vulnerability in the context of the practical constitution of embodiment. So given this, the dynamics involved in this intertwining of perceptual sensibility, feelings, kinesthetic synthesis, unifying the continuity of embodiment, we also have a potential horizon related to the bodily movement that allows us to experience the sudden discontinuity of experience of harm as the frustration of a passive expectation of continuity. However, in the case of vulnerability, we additionally have a sort of affective anticipation of harm, which is not the act of anticipation in a full-fledged object, as when we wait for the bus at the bus stop, but emerges with when a series of events, such like the lighting suddenly of going out everywhere, accompanied with a loud noise, motivate a state of alertness that prevails for some moments, even when nothing else happens afterward. In this case, the emotional disposition is neither of the type of a sensible feeling, nor of the type of an actual emotion oriented toward an object, but is the arousal of an affective state of mind lingering for an indeterminate time, while nevertheless entailing a certain orientation toward indeterminate object. The phenomenological tradition refers to this condition. I don't like actually this affective state of mind as translation of this. Well, the phenomenological tradition refers to this like with the label of moods. The actual German expression for this is Stimmung, and also, well, the other is Befindlichkeit. Of course, the expression Stimmung points at the same time both to the embodied ways of finding oneself in the world in a kind of attunement and to an emotive background of experience that exhibits the surrounding world as something that somehow illuminates under affective light. And within the phenomenological tradition, we have these multiple descriptions coinciding in the idea of formation of an atmosphere or light. We have this in Husserl, Edith Stein, Geiger, and other phenomenologists, also Fender, as an emotive resonance that involves the lived body itself. This is particularly clear in Husserl, or even even though this concept of Stimmung is not precisely as univocal as we would like to have it in Husserl's manuscripts, some of his descriptions can be understood in terms of the affective unity of the stream of consciousness, and even as a form of emotive background of the experience. And on the other hand, even if moods may not refer to an object that explicitly motivates them, Husserl acknowledges that moods preserves a sort of intentionality that can be systematized in terms of non-thematic forms of intentionality. The first attempt to work out this possibility was from Ludwig Landgrebe in the 30s. However, Husserl disagreed with this attempt of give moods an elemental or premier role in the constitution of the world of horizons. According to Husserl, Landgrebe was like following a Heideggerian interpretation of his notion of horizon by making this claim, even in the context of the fundierte Akte, the founded acts. There is a kind of horizon intentionality involved in the emotive background consciousness presenting the moods, present in the moods, and they correlate as founded in primitive acts of representations. But Heidegger's existential account of moods reframed the entire understanding of moods beyond this psychological presupposition, still present in Husserl and the other phenomenologists I already mentioned. Even though for Husserl, Stein, Geiger, and it is possible to claim that this emotional disposition, such as moods, project an emotional atmosphere in the surrounding world, such expansion, Ausbreitung, is still a subjectively oriented way in which the environment is exhibited. On the contrary, for Heidegger, mood has always already disclosed being in the world as a wall and first makes possible directing oneself towards something. Being attuned is not initially related to something physical, it is itself not an inner condition, which then in some mysterious way reaches out and leaves its mark on things and persons. Thus for Heidegger, end of quote, for Heidegger, modes and modes of attunement are constitutive dimension of human existence and refer there to the being in the world. As Jason Troop points out in this regard, I quote, to be attuned is thus to precisely find oneself already in relation to the world and responsive to it, end of quote. Additionally, Heidegger's description of attunement, of fear in this case, allows an interesting clarification of the sense of harmfulness that is not explored from the perspective of a present or even eventual infliction of bodily harm, but from the broader perspective of the ontological possibilities of human existence. Heidegger outlines this description of phenomenon of fear, the phenomenon of fear, in three moments. That before we are afraid, which is not the object since it's not given, but refers to that in the face of which we fear, the fearsome as such, and that about which fear is afraid. However, that in the face of which we fear is characterized as threatening. Thus, we fear what we feel as threatening and therefore as harmful or detrimental. What is interesting is this doesn't involve immediately the embodiment in the way we were like trying to explain it in the past moments in this presentation. Here, Heidegger is attempting to describe a more general dimension of fear and treat that what is at stake in our table of describing vulnerability, following this emphasis in the body. However, Heidegger's description of fear allows us to understand vulnerability as a non-ontic dimension of corporeality, which is not a thing, but the unity of an ongoing process of formation of sense. In this particular sense, the harmful has its target the living body as a part of what, I quote Heidegger, definite range of what we be affected by it. So by it means the harmful. It is interesting to consider not only how Heidegger describes the relation between this target and the harmful in terms of proximity and distance, but also how this points to fear, I quote, as it approaches harmfulness, radiates, and thus as has the character of threatening, while the ability to draw near is itself freed to the essential existential spatiality of being in the world, end of quote. Additionally, according to Heidegger, I quote again, the about which fear is afraid is the fearful being itself, Dasein, end of quote. Here is where vulnerability comes into consideration, because it seems that vulnerability does not only refer to the potential interruption of an ongoing synthesis of my bodily movement or bodily capabilities, but entails a deeper sense of being exposed to potential affliction in the self in a most concrete sense possible. Again, it is not just that I fail to perform a movement or I am affected in my interaction with others, as if it were just a matter of fragility of damage. And this is again my point. Vulnerability is not mere fragility or damage, but vulnerability in this case refers to something that threatens what matters most, my own integrity. This is, according to my position, the most important aspect to be considered with regard to vulnerability. What is like makes me vulnerable, or what this vulnerability is like referring to, is precisely the possibility of a threat to what matters most, my integrity, my dignity, the most important values. Similarly, to fear for someone is to understand that given certain circumstances, she or he is vulnerable in his or her integrity under threat, is because threat is significant to me. During the course of this description of fear, however, Heidegger does not refer to the body, and according to what we already indicated above regarding the body and its practices in Landgrave and Husserl, we may say that the possibility of moving away from what is threatening and the inclination to get closer to what feels comfortable or pleasurable motivates the resulting movement. Heidegger may say that these dispositions are founded and are secondary with regard to the more original display of affective structures involved. But here everything depends on how we understand the corporeal dimension of human experience. Heidegger explicitly distanced himself from the primacy of sensibility, especially sentiments, Gefühlen, in the context of his own account of attunements. And this explains why he disagrees, regards pain and suffering in his broader account of harmfulness. But whether the body tendencies are grounded in more original attunements, or the attunements themselves are emotive expression of the synthesis of sense that it is possible to describe in accordance with a reflective account of intentionality, the experience itself of finding oneself faced with threatening still motivates a question regarding a paradoxical sense of being exposed to what is threatening, one whose field of disclosure is one's own body, I will say. Heidegger explains why the sequence of non-objective relations configure the field of the relation between fear and threatening in the context of being in the world. Fear is the fear of getting stuck in the middle in a situation with no room for actualizing the display of other possibilities. The fear is more intense after experiences something threatening, where my control over my body has a free flow of movements and affective fields has already become beyond me. The body is annulled, and it's in its dispositional abilities, and the experience of feeling trapped in my own body arises. It is my own body then that exposes me, or exposes what I am, namely something that can be reached, that the threat can reach. After Heidegger, but with more influence of Husserl, Ludwig Landgrave outlined his own description of moods. In contradistinction to Heidegger, Landgrave explicitly emphasizes the importance of considering the topic within a broader account of sensations and corporeality, closer to the idea of a transcendental constitution of life words in terms of Husserl. Furthermore, one of the most relevant aspects of Landgrave's attempts of reconciling Husserl's description with Heidegger is the claim that it is possible to trace the genesis of intentionality back to the lived body original capability for self-motivated movement, with the lived body understood as the result of kinesthetic and affective synthesis. For Landgrave, the there that Heidegger refers in the Sinussite as the original dimension of being thrown in the world, a dimension revealed through a Befindlichkeit, is related to the most original dispositional capabilities, in the terms of Landgrave, Vermöglichkeiten, or of the lived body, the Leiblichkeit, or lived corporeality. Thus, Landgrave attempts to describe the individuation and facticity of the transcendental I in terms of this relation to this primordial capability, the self-movement of the lived body revealed in an attuned movement. This account with Landgrave, I won't explain all this part because it is too long, allows us to reframe a little bit the Heidegger's description of fear with trying to like reconciling or at least taking some important aspects into considering also the experience of lived body. So for Landgrave, the moods, yes, for Landgrave moods, we have a more like alternative perspective from Heidegger. So Landgrave remarks this dispositional corporeality, allowing like this different appraisal of Heidegger's description that we may like take for our consideration of vulnerability. If according to Landgrave, moods are to be understood as dispositions for performing actions with regard to a determinate way of experiencing the surrounding world, this is the reframing of Landgrave regarding moods, what we have is in the condition of vulnerability is exactly the opposite, namely being deprived of capabilities, of being deprived of the very basis for its performances. It is important to remark that the sense of fragility that emerges in realizing one's own vulnerability does not point a merely accidental circumstance, but the constitutive contingency that belongs to the materiality of our existence. Following Nicholas de Warren in this context, we may even suggest that what we have at stake in a radical experience of vulnerability, such as torture, is the fragility of our trust in the world. The dimension that emerges in vulnerability is the world as a precarious field of practical potentialities. However, to feel vulnerable is not only to feel oneself under constant threat, but also to experience a decrease of the range of possible actions. It is to feel that our actions fall short with regard to our possible aims. It is a constant sense of failing to be able to display our practical possibilities. To feel vulnerable is to experience an imbalance in the immediate expectations that nevertheless persist without finding a determinate resolution, provoking a particular sort of distress and sorrow, one that may linger for a long time as an emotional disposition, such as the one described by the Mexican phenomenologist Emilio Uranga, with the Spanish expression of zozobra. Zozobra, says Uranga, quote, refers to a mode of being that incessantly oscillates between two possibilities, between two affects without knowing which one of those to hold onto, to grab as justification, discarding the opposite extreme without mercy. So I don't even know how to translate zozobra, but this is the way he like describes this sense of feeling that we can precisely this with that all our potentialities fall short with regard to the practical aims. The importance of a phenomenological oriented reflection in cultural anthropology with regard to a moral dimension of moods is present in the research of philosophers and scholars like Jason Troop, who developed an investigation based on the ethnographic research on experience of affliction. An interesting point from Troop's investigation is the fact that he emphasizes the moral dimension of moods, which is crucial for understanding how our sense of normativity is rooted in basic emotional experiences. In this case, the role of vulnerability in this context. Well, I want to go further to the last part of the presentation regarding the positive balance of vulnerability. According to our preliminary results, consciousness of vulnerability involves an emotional anticipation of harm accompanied by such emotive dispositions as fear, concern, anxiety, zozobra, and so on. In the reflective sphere, the consciousness of vulnerability appears as a belief motivated by former experiences of failure of my practical capabilities to perform actions, of the eventual consequences of such failures, and the fact of being physically exposed, especially because we expect such failures to lead to external affections. The anticipation of failure of any possible project is implicit. It is an implicit recognition of the limitations, not only of my body, but of my entire life. And this results in a pre-reflective and practical awareness of myself as subject to harm, to be harmed. In this regard, we may raise the question regarding those modes of intentional reference that reveal through their own horizons the realm of the worth of our life as a personal and individual life, given prior any theoretical account of ourselves. We describe vulnerability in terms of a fundamental experience of our own corporeality, and in the circumstance of eventually the being deprived of the field of practical potentialities, and in terms of a field of potential harm beyond of our control. However, it is also there is also a normative sense that belongs to vulnerability, a sense grounded in what Steinbock, following Vandenfels, calls limit claims. This as a modification of a Grenzachtung and Grenzverletzung, since those limits are not respected. It corresponds to vulnerability as the understanding of harm and harmless, not only as, oh, sorry, Jesus Christ. So we were here. So it corresponds to vulnerability as the understanding of harm and harmless, not only as potential damage, but as something that is wrong and unfair. In this context, in the context of vulnerability, with regard to a scenario of violence, the performance of a violent action towards someone presupposes a claim of limits as an unthematized standard that gives violence its sense of a transgression. As Steinbock remarks, violence, I quote, is literally the violation of limit claims, the violation of limit claims that take place in two ways, both of which attempt to make inaccessible, what is inaccessible accessible. I will add that this is not only a matter of making someone accessible or available for those who impose their will over others violently. As a matter of fact, there are also non-violent forms of attempting to gain access to what Steinbock calls the inaccessible. For instance, when we aim to honor the trust of others. Nevertheless, we may suggest also with Steinbock that this possibility includes how we ourselves become vulnerable before those we trust. In this case, the subject agrees to become vulnerable and reveal him or herself before others. In violence, this happens precisely the other way around, but under the common presupposition of this vulnerability as opportunity of being harmed. Well, this is important for me in this regard. And finally, where is Levinas? Here. Okay, finally, we have also other possibilities in the phenomenological tradition of exploring vulnerability. And I think Levinas, this is the part that I have explored less in my investigation, but Levinas has a positive, or it gives account of a positive perspective of vulnerability. First of all, for Levinas, sensibility and passivity points to a different dimension rather than this cognitive function in acts of apprehension. By exploring the affective dimension of sensibility in experience like touch, Levinas suggests that sensibility exhibits a sense of being exposed, thus consists in a radical passivity prior to any egoic activity, as the sense of what he calls the condition of having being offered without holding back. And such condition is at the core of vulnerability. We'll have this long quote of Levinas. I won't read it. I would prefer to work a little bit further in order to have a discussion. In contrastation to the phenomenological tradition, including not only Husserl and Heidegger, but also Scheller, Levinas raises the question of different understanding of affectivity, one that does not involve acts of cognition, displaying the structure of empty intentional acts of sense bestowal and acts of fulfillment, even in the case of revelation of values. If we return to Husserl, vulnerability and being exposed to harm are understood as a negative fulfillment of active performances of or empty intentional tendencies toward an anticipated content, even in the practical sphere. With Heidegger, we already observed how an alternative way of understanding this correlation, one that does not presuppose a subject-object-oriented schema, but has the structure of a mode of attunement, revealing the dare of our condition of being in the world. According to this Heideggerian approach, such condition is at the basis of the constitution of vulnerable body. Thus, vulnerability is not a mere accidental predicate that depends upon external conditions, but refers to the core of human existence, the Dasein itself, revealed in the mode of attunement of fear and its direction toward the harmful. Levinas, by his part, insists on the need for a self, or needs of a reconsideration of sensibility in order to take into account the sense of exposure that reveals the self and its givenness with regard to being offered without holding back. Such a condition allows us to point the centrality of vulnerability in the original access to sense, not as the result of an intersubjective dynamic of accomplishments, as it is the case in Husserl, but with regard to something that, according to Levinas, is more original, alterity. We are vulnerable before others, and this does not necessarily have a negative sense. On the contrary, it is precisely by referring to this original sense of radical passivity that it is possible to overcome the centrality of subjectivity and make room for the dimension of alterity as the space of the emergence of this sense emergence in an ethical orientation. In a similar context, Anthony Steinberg also remarks on the positive balance of vulnerability in this account of moral emotional dispositions such as trust. It is because this exposure related to vulnerability that we may bound to others in context of trust. And as the result of our investigation, then we have delivered some descriptive accounts of this phenomenological tradition that yield possible explorations of experience of feeling vulnerable from an experience-oriented perspective. Well, right at the end of this presentation, I would like also just to mention how my research agenda is like turning from this transcendental phenomenological account of vulnerability to a such, well, so to speak, critical perspective in phenomenology. In this regard, I am like following, well, yes, a little bit of Husserl still, but especially it is important for me the way attempted by philosophers in Latin America, like Luis Villoro, which he was like very interested also in Husserl, especially the philosophy of values, the doctrine of values, which one may find in Ideas 2, and he takes some of these aspects into a ethical political account of the experience of values. For Villoro, the point he points out the most is the relevance of such negative experiences as the way we more primordially have access to value. The values are not originally, in all cases, given in positives experience of enjoyment. This is like the classic example of Husserl, but most of the cases, according to Villoro, the values are opened up because of their absence. They are prominent in absence. So this is the part I am like trying to relate this phenomenology of vulnerability with what Villoro is trying to discuss in a completely different context. He's discussing with John Rawls and Habermas the idea of justice. And Villoro's claim is that instead of trying to universalize the notion of justice from a more formal perspective or a reconstruction based in this theory, the Habermas theory of communicative action, he thinks that it is possible to also universalize in a certain way an idea of justice following what we experience as unjust. See, the injustice is more concrete. It is a more concrete experience of a possible justice than these formal accounts of justice. And what my claim is that, or what I am like trying to construct or develop is the subject of this political philosophy Villoro is trying to develop. And well, my claim is this subject is not this rational member of a community, this European community of people discussing in a very civilized way how we can have a more just society, but a vulnerable subject. Someone who, what are you saying? What are you talking about? I am hungry. There is no water around here. I am like suffering violence of this narco war we have in Mexico. So this is the context we are like trying to think with these problems of justice. So my claim is that, well, perhaps we can add to this negative theory of justice that Villoro was trying to develop, adding this reflection of vulnerability and the way vulnerability, well, it's not only related to the description of our human condition, but also how vulnerability is related to the way we experience in a more original and primordial sense the origin of values, the origin of our normative and practical orientation. Well, this is more or less what I have for all of you. Thank you very much for your attention this morning, afternoon in Russia. And well, I hear your comments. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. So please feel free to ask your questions. Thank you for the lecture. Are there any questions from the public? I have questions, but yeah, Veronica, please.
Yes, yeah. Thank you, Ignacio. Thank you very much. It was really passionating for me. I would have two questions, actually several, but I will start with two questions, and then if we have time, I would ask later the other questions. First of all, I'm very interested right now in developing a phenomenology of finitude. I'm right now working on the relationship between ethics and the idea of God, and I'm trying like to develop a kind of phenomenology of moral finitude. Perhaps it's my Kantian, you know, that I worked a lot on Kant, and finitude is very important in his philosophy, and I'm trying to see how we could develop this on a phenomenological level, the consciousness of our own finitude. And I'm wondering if we could conceive this vulnerability as a form, consciousness of our own finitude. So how, because especially when you talked about limit claims, so it's the idea of Steinbock, it really reminds me of this idea of limit and of finitude. So would you agree that the phenomenology of vulnerability is a form of phenomenology of finitude? So would you like to answer now my first question, or would you like to hear my second question?
It is easier to ask to respond the first question, because yes, the answer is yes. And actually, I am very interested in trying to understand this subject better in the context of Kant, because finitude in Kant is not only a theoretical problem, but also, and particularly, I will say, it is a moral problem. The way, well, I just want to say, mention this in Kant. And perhaps you can like respond better. I mean, perhaps I can ask you this question. I am interested in understanding the relation between finitude and the evil in Kant, especially not only in his earlier texts like this, the negative magnitudes and so on, but also in the critical of pure reason. Right at the end of this amphibiologies of the what is the name of this part, the end of the analytical of principles, when he starts speaking precisely about this, the limits, and the resistance of the real, I wonder how this is connected both to the experience of finitude in Kant and also with this vulnerability. I have the idea that Kant is coping in the moral context with an implicit recognition of our vulnerability. He's emphasizing the autonomy of reason and this certain, like, not, well, I don't know, taking away of our consideration for our moral judgments, the centrality of emotions, is precisely because he's aware that emotions makes us vulnerable. It makes us, this is a way of, I mean, his practical philosophy is a way of coping finitude in a moral context, precisely because he's like recognizing that we are emotional beings. He's not like, I mean, in a certain accounts of Kant, they like think that the moral subject of Kant is someone like Mr. Spock in this Star Trek thing. No, he's no feelings. He has no feelings. No, it's exactly the opposite. He's aware that we are cruel, and the emotions makes us egoist and cruel. And that is precisely the need of this moral orientation, because he's recognizing that that is precisely what we are. His appreciation of human beings is very negative. It's very negative. We are finite, we are cruel by nature, and we are like emotional oriented. And this is precisely, we need like moral education and rational orientation of our will, or in order, well, because the alternative will be like precisely what we have in well, near your territories now, unfortunately.
Yes, but I would say that Kant, he doesn't really use the word emotion. He rather used the word trieb, the pulsions, which is by the way also developed in phenomenology. So, but what is yes, so I totally agree with you. There is a moral finitude of a human being in Kant, which is due to, you could also say, to our corporeity, to our phenomenal existence, not noumenal, not purely rational. But what is interesting is that for Kant this is negative, but in phenomenology, as you tried to show, this is like it's the opposite. Like, as if I understood well, according to you, from a phenomenological point of view, ethics somehow originates from our bodily, corporeal, lived bodily dimension. So this is like the opposite. It's not a limit to our ethical capability as it would be for Kant, but it's the opposite. So would you agree with this? That it's so. Then how to understand this this finitude or this limit? Because it's not like in Kant. It's not from our bodily dimension that it's finitude.
Yes.
Ethical finitude arise.
Well, this is super complicated, and I think that the problem of comparing with this, you're the expert here, because the problem of comparing Kant and Husserl first, well, Kant and phenomenologists in general, but well, the one I know better is Husserl, is that they have different theories of judgment, different theories of will. The account of will of Kant is, what I want to say is that for Kant, all what we do in phenomenology is, in a way, is a sort of empirical anthropology. He will like say, why are you so concerned with the way the humans experience emotions? Because emotions are empirical. So you cannot do transcendental claims from the emotions, according to Kant. And according to Husserl, and I quote explicitly Husserl from the lectures of 1924, Kant did not understand what a priori mean. And he said that like explicitly. Kant does not understand what is a priori. Yes, but of course, this is too much. But what he means is that for Husserl, we actually have experience of the a priori. For Kant, that is nonsense. So these philosophies, even though they are like very close in certain aspects, and also it is very fruitful to have this discussion, especially in this context of finitude, which is, I will say, not a topic that, this is interesting, because in the other way around, you have also Husserl not understanding why finitude is so important for Kant. This is also something important. For Husserl, finitude is not that important. Actually, finitude is a matter of empirical facticity. What is the transcendental relevance of finitude? And for Kant, is, oh my God, what are you talking about? This is precisely the point. The limits are the point of my philosophy. So, I don't know. It's super complicated.
Yes, and there is also, by the way, there is also an interesting critique of Levinas of finitude, but because he understands this concept of finitude, Levinas, as in its Kantian meaning, and he says that I don't want to develop like a finite understanding of the subject, in the sense that it would be like a kind of reason which is incarnated in a body, and this would be a limit to reason. And so he says explicitly that he's against this concept of finitude. And so if I understood well, for you, vulnerability is not a form of finitude. So we should separate these two concepts.
I have to think about it,
okay,
because I cannot give a straight answer.
Well, it's just because I'm very interested in, yeah.
I will say yes, but first of all, what is finitude and what is its place in this, all this discussion between Kant and Husserl? Well, I will be looking forward your investigation of phenomenology of finitude.
And if I have time, do I have time, Georgi, to ask a second question? Yes. So then my question would be like, what would, is there something that could somehow, perhaps not totally, counter our vulnerability? Could this be, for example, the teleological life of transcendental subjectivity, which is so important for Husserl? Because, for example, I forgot in which manuscript exactly, but perhaps you know that Husserl has a very interesting idea about the suicide, and he says basically, I don't remember exactly the text, that what is actually countering or what can counter our desire for suicide is our teleological consciousness, that we understand that somehow the value of our existence is not limited to our individual existence, but it is part of a more intersubjective and even eternal telos of humanity, which is the reason. Yes, like Husserl has very interesting concept here. Like he uses the idea of eternal, also the idea of God. There is something very almost religious in this teleological conception of humanity. And could you say that then this teleological consciousness could somehow counter this consciousness of our own vulnerability as an individual?
Yes, but in a negative way. And this is precisely what I am trying to emphasize. The teleology is expressed in this case or experienced through the experience of failure. So I feel I failed. I mean, the possibility of failure discloses another possibility of understanding teleology, which is not that optimistical as we usually, and especially Husserl, used to give account of this teleology of reason. And he also thinks that, well, the consciousness is teleologically oriented towards the good and so on and so forth. But yes, but how we experience such orientation. And I will say that it is not always in a positive way, but most of the cases we have this teleological, we are aware of this teleological orientation through the opposite, the failure. So which it sounds like strange, but it's precisely the when I realize what matters most and how I can orient myself towards what matters most for me. Most of the cases is precisely when I am aware of I can lose it or I failed. So this is the part I prefer to emphasize this problem in my account of vulnerability, which is not precisely the way Husserl's, because Husserl is very optimistical. Well, there is some texts when the older he was, the less optimistical he became, but I don't know. So in my appreciation, he remained very like optimistical regarding this teleology. If he could like live a little bit more and experience what happened right after his death in Europe, perhaps he would like change a little bit his mind regarding this optimistical appreciation of humanity and teleology. But well, so it happened. Thank you, Veronica.
Thank you, Ignacio.
And Han had a question. You still have it? Please.
Yeah, I do. Ignacio, thank you very much for your presentation. I also have two questions. One is a larger one, and another one is pretty, I think, small and easy, but I'll start from the more important one. It considers the phenomenon of invulnerability, which you didn't really, I think, took into consideration here, but this concept appeared to me when I was thinking about the empirical variations of vulnerable experience that might be the source for phenomenological investigation. And I was thinking about this very first experience of pre-reflective vulnerability that a child has when it's born, and in its childhood, when there is this complex, not exactly the feeling of a body which is not really under control. And this is like the body where we cannot really separate the living body and the body as my object, and the limits are not precise. And what if we consider the so-called like genetic epistemological approach, then in fact, until a certain moment, this vulnerability is something like the vulnerability of at the same time of a child and of the world as such. And afterwards, what we have described by, for example, Walter Benjamin, is the period of like child as a master of the world and as a hero, for whom, together with this control of his or her own body, it seems that the whole world can be like conquered, can be open for any possibility. And this period is also still before the reflection, I think, I mean, I'm not sure, but I think that it's still before the reflection of one's own finitude. So phenomenon of invulnerability, which appears maybe genetically like in a child experience next, just right after the very first situation, the givenness of a vulnerable being. And I wonder if there is any chance, or do you consider the possibility to go to these child's experience phenomena of vulnerable and invulnerable in that way?
Well, it's a very, very interesting and a tough question, because yes, I didn't consider invulnerability. And of course, I understand your point, and you're right. The children think they are invulnerable. They are not aware of their vulnerability. Actually, a colleague of mine in Peru, I remember he also made a similar like critique to my account, precisely taking in consideration the experience of the children. Well, but what I will say first, that one thing is that how we, perhaps what makes us more vulnerable is not being aware of how vulnerable we are. Perhaps that is the most like radical experience of vulnerability. Actually, it's not like having like experiencing pain or the actual failure, but not knowing how vulnerable we are. Vulnerability, something that is very interesting for me, is that is a possibility, is a field of possibilities. Our awareness of vulnerability is never a like a fulfilled consciousness. So I know how vulnerable we are. I am. There is no way I can be more vulnerable as the way I am vulnerable now. Not that that is not true. We never know how the possibilities of vulnerability is the possibility of that. Perhaps, I mean, the idea that the things can be always worst in predictable ways. So the children think they are invulnerable, but they are not. Actually, they are the most vulnerable of all of us, precisely because they don't know how vulnerable they are. I remember, well, I don't remember exactly what proposition, but the Spinoza mentions, I think it's the proposition 54 or something in the third book of Ethics, no, the fourth, when he is like giving account of why being humble is not a virtue. And in the explanation of this proposition, he says that humility is an idea that comes from our representation of ourselves from the point of view of being less. And then he says, well, that is incorrect, because our perspective of our possible failures always comes from outside. And once I fail, so if I start thinking about myself as someone who cannot do something, which is precisely what the claim of being humble is, oh, I am not that good, I am not that intelligent. So Spinoza says, why you think about yourself this way? Because, and especially from the point of view of the body, or when with Spinoza, nobody knows what a body can until it can or cannot. So the body doesn't think about itself, or the body only acts. So the reaches of the bodily movement and action is something that the body only knows with regard to its actual performances. So to think about vulnerability in this regard, for according to Spinoza, is like, why are you so concerned with these ideas? From the point, what I want to say is that from the point of view of the body is invulnerable. The body doesn't think about itself as something vulnerable. It's invulnerable because it's the projection of positive possibilities, like the children, the children precisely. The children have an experience of their body in this invulnerability. My body is what I can do with my body, not what I cannot. What I cannot comes always from, hey, you don't. An adult saying to him or her, no, please, no. Don't run, say, be quiet or something. From the point of view of the children, they can do whatever they can. Not precisely they want, because they don't even know what they want is most of the cases. They do what they can. And the limits come from the others or from their actual failures. So it's interesting. I don't know if I am like following your points, but more or less this is what I have to say in this regard. I like it, this appreciation. See, this is a good point, being invulnerable. I don't know, it's like, I never liked the superheroes, for instance. I prefer the wounded ones, the fragile, that are my heroes. My heroes are more human. I don't like Superman. Those guys. I prefer Batman, for instance. Batman would get hurted. I'll get away. I don't know. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I also have a small second question.
Yes, please.
It's about this very interesting concept of zozobra, which is a little problematic to translate. I just wondered, maybe you could give a glimpse of an example, or I don't know, literary hero, or some kind of example that could clarify it a little bit, because it's very intriguing. Thank you.
Zozobra is exactly what the people in Ukraine is living right now. It's not knowing what will come next. It's an state of not knowing what will come next, and being deprived of all what they had, like the moment of being aware of how the world, the surrounding world is falling away. So this is zozobra. Zozobra is the state of mind where I don't know what will come next, and how what will come tomorrow, and how I am constantly deprived of the most immediate means of subsistence, and how especially also is the sense of being well, yes, deprived of the control over my life. I cannot make projects what I wanted to do next week or tomorrow. In other places of the world, people perhaps think about holidays on or visiting a grandmother in the weekend or something, no, having a birthday. What happened with all these people that perhaps having birthday? So this is your birthday cake. You have an invasion of your country right now, and this in TV everywhere. And what will come next? This is the, or perhaps in not less dramatic, but another example is what happened with many people during the strong days of the pandemic. We didn't know anything at the very beginning of the pandemic. We didn't know anything about the virus. So we started experiences this zozobra of not knowing. It's more or less like, yes, not knowing what will come next and being deprived of the possibility of how to say this, agency of our present situation. It's like an anxiety. It's like this is similar to this anxiety of Heidegger, but is zozobra. Well, zozobra is like this expression actually comes from the context of the how could you say this? It's from the boats, the ships. It's like a shipwreck, with the ships like goes down and the starting like falling down very very slowly. This is like zozobra, precisely. Zozobra it also has the sense of a failure. You say the failure of the situation. Everything falls away. Everything falls away, and I don't know what will come next. And I feel that I fail even before trying. This is the zozobra. Yes.
Yeah, I would like also to ask a question in this direction. So I'll give word to myself. Actually, I'm also really interested in this concept from Uranga. And could you please explain how it was presented as a kind of national Stimmung, so to say, culturally defined, or rather general part of being a human being? Okay. So when, if it is the rather first option, then could we say that yeah, happy countries, so to say, are more or less happy in the same way, but the misfortunate countries are misfortune in their own way. So the misfortune, it's what define certain culture, or when it's not the case, when it is rather part of being in the world, so to say, generalized, not culturally determined, then how can we deal with different kinds of Stimmung? So could you please precise this?
Yes. Well, Uranga was a very, very, well, perhaps I can bring Uranga's book. He was a very, very strange character in Mexican philosophy. He wrote this book, The Analysis of Mexican Being, which is the title is very, very rare, even for us. It's like, what is this? No? He wrote this in the 50s, and he has a very strong influence of Heidegger. Actually, he met Heidegger in Freiburg, and also was in the Husserl archives with Walter Wimmel. He has a very strong influence of phenomenology in his early years. And what he was attempting to do is that he wanted to localize the fundamental ontology in the context of the historical, in this case in Mexico. So if Heidegger is right, and we are supposed to reflect upon our existential condition, which is also an historical condition, so the drama of the Mexican existence is what he was like trying to do in this book. And actually, this notion of zozobra, he takes it from one of our national poets, which is Ramon López Velarde. And well, he's like our Helderling, so to say. Like Heidegger with Helderling, Uranga was like thinking about López Velarde. And he, well, actually the last part of the book is a sort of hermeneutical examination of this Mexican poetry in order to understand the national stream. But however, there is something important in contradistinction with other accounts of these national representations. We have also the Labyrinth of Solitude of Octavio Paz, more or less the same year, which is a literary essay, very, very important also for Uranga, and other accounts of the identity of Mexico. This is in the 50s, and all other countries, in Cuba, in Argentina, we have these explorations of philosophers trying to think about this and the national identity. What is important is it is not an essentialist perspective of, in this case, the Mexican. He wasn't attempting to present what is the essence of the Mexican, but how we can understand our existence from the point of view of what we have been so far. Mexico is the result of an accident. This is the point of view of Uranga. So we don't have this sense of like, I don't know, with this relation with history, in this heroic sense of history, like certain politicians in Russia, they have this idea of the great empire and so forth. And we don't have that. We failed everywhere. We were conquered, and then we had a revolution, and the revolution failed, and we are like failing after failure after failure. Like our history is the history of being conquered, of being invaded, but by other countries, France and United States. We are always struggling with the United States. It's a very powerful country. We are not. And so the idea of Uranga is that the Mexicans, we are like, I'll have this short quote of Uranga, we are at root loss and ruin, sin and lack. We are experiencing a constant state of zozobra, because this is precisely the moment, especially in the 50s, Mexico was like trying to organize a possible project of nation. We had the sense of we arrived late to modernity. So we have these revolutions. We have all the 19th century where war after war, nationals and invasions. And then the 20th century, we have the Mexican Revolution. We was like something important and then failed and converted into a sort of a democratic dictatorship. And then we were like, what we can do as a nation. So this is interesting, because they were like trying to present a historical hermeneutics of all the Uranga, and also the early Luis Villoro, Octavio Paz, and other thinkers and philosophers of this time. They developed a sort of historicism, like existential historicism, as a way to give account of what was going on in Mexico in that way. So this is important. It wasn't like the essence of Mexicans, or they were not nationalists. This is important. In the appreciation of the Mexican is the opposite of the heroical perspective of history. They were like trying to make us aware of how lost and lack of everything we are, and as a starting point of a national project. So we need this existential analytic of ourselves, our esteem, our condition, in order to project something. This is also why Heidegger was so important for them, because this chance or opportunity, okay, we don't have this heroical history behind us, but if what defines better the human existence is not the past but the future, oh, then we need Heidegger and Sartre and these philosophers that emphasize the future because we lack of this historical heroicity. So this is more or less the context of Emilio Uranga. Unfortunately, he didn't follow it. After this analysis of the Mexican being, he he was involved also in politics, and also, I mean, he progressively lived away the philosophy, his interest in philosophy. Well, that was bad because he was a very beautiful mind. Yes. Thank you.
As we know, Zozobra is unfortunately not the only Stimmung. We have also Relajo as something important for the phenomenology of the...
Yes, from Jorge Portilla, which was also other phenomenologist, even most interesting by my point of view than Uranga. He attempted a phenomenology of the relajo, which is like, it is the Mexican Stimmung by excellence. The relajo is like, it's not taking so serious anything. So it's a suspension of seriousness. So it's a sort of practical epopee on the situation. When the things go too serious, we start like making jokes and doing something. And if according to Portilla, we do that because we don't want to embrace our freedom. He was more Sartrean than Heideggerian. So since we don't want to it's like a sort of bad fate, the relajo. So we start like making this in it's very idiomatic because the relajo is not something you can like do. It's like something that starts with a joke and then the entire situation becomes something not that serious. So this is the idea of the relajo. It's not making party. It's just like taking away but in a very subtle way, taking away the seriousness of a situation because we don't want to embrace the value or something, because the values are grounded in our freedom. We decide what is important, but since we don't want to take decisions, we're starting like, well, I was just joking, okay? So I didn't mean to get married, you know, like marriage, no, it's not that important, marriage. So this is the way precisely the relajo. And we have several situations when we like, we call with this word, relajo is a Mexican expression. It's very Mexican. With the other countries in Latin America or Spain, they don't use this expression. So this is very distinctive of our culture. In the case of Uranga, he was, Portilla, he was less, or his emphasis in history wasn't that present as it is in Uranga. He's more like a phenomenological psychology, but in a very interesting phenomenological orientation, because his account of the relajo is with regard to the experience of values and the way values are connected with elections and, with decisions. So it's interesting. And I think both are translated into English. Analysis of Mexican Being and the Phenomenology of Relajo, which was translated as the suspensions of seriousness. Since relajo is very complicated to be translated, the translator decided the suspension of seriousness. They are both in English. Very, very like recent translations of these books. They are our phenomenologists. We're very, very short, but we have some tradition in Mexico in phenomenology.
Thanks a lot. Are there any other questions? Yeah, Veronica, пожалуйста.
Yes, Ignacio, do you think that there is a relationship between this famous work of Luis Villoro on the indigenism in Mexico, Los Grandes Momentos de los Indigenismo en México,
yes.
And all this reflection on not essentialist but historical on the Mexican being?
Yes, no, that book is very important. The title is not that beautiful as the book is. The great moments of Mexican, of the indigenism in Mexico. It was like, oh my God, what is this? It's a book of anthropology, of history. What is this? This book is from 1950, and Villoro is like Uranga, essay of Mexican being, but Villoro took well, what I want to say is that Villoro was less speculative about this question regarding the identity of the Mexicans. So what he attempted to do was to develop a reflection about how the different agents of Mexican history took their identity from the speech, the discourse regarding the indigenous people. So this was before Foucault. This is very interesting. It's very close to the history of how do you say this? History de la folie, or how this is in, I don't remember the book in Foucault. The history of
madness.
Madness, yes, thank you. The history of madness, yes. This was before the history of madness, and it's very close to the way Foucault developed these ideas. And Villoro took his methodological orientation from Sartre, from being a nothingness. So this dialectics of otherness is the only theoretical, I mean, philosophical book which is quoted in the book. All the book is a historiographical reflection of the way the different agents of history of Mexico since the conquer to the 50s spoke about the indigenous people, and how through this speech, this discourse, they developed or constructed the identity and the justification of what they are. So Hernan Cortés spoke about the indigenous people, and he said, well, I am the one who is here is because my destiny is to, I don't know, discover this country, or I am the priest and my destiny is to like inform and include the indigenous people into the Catholic religion, for instance. So it is very, very interesting, this book. As I said, he tried to explore this historical constitution of Mexican identity, but from the point of view of the alterity. So, and how all this time, all along, the indigenous people never spoke. They were only the one who we were these different agents of the history of Mexico had to speak about in order to develop their own identity, but over the silence of the indigenous people. And according to Villoro, the moment, our moment of indigenism is to let the indigenous speak this time. He has a strong commitment with the Zapatista movement in Mexico in the 90s. So it's very, very important. So, but yes, it's a great book. Villoro was our best philosopher ever. Yes, he had very, very interesting books. He translated Husserl. He made a lot of things. It was very, very important. And that was his first book, 1950. That one is not translated in any language as long as I know, unfortunately, because it's very, very important. Okay.
Are there any questions? I would like to ask a question. At the end of your talk, you mentioned critical phenomenology.
Yes.
Could you develop, please, a little bit on this project? Does it mean politically engaged, or more in the sense of critique of ideology or critique of social problems? In which sense it is critical, and what authors would you advise to read to go in this direction?
Well, in this regard, I have to say two things. First, I am not the one who speaks about critical phenomenology. It's an ongoing movement in the United States. There is people speaking about critical phenomenology. There is even a journal of critical phenomenology, very recent in the United States. And they are exploring the possibilities of approaching a phenomenological tradition with the critical theory, which is something I am very interested into as well. However, the way I engage, this is the second thing I want to say, the way I engage the critical phenomenology, and also, for instance, in UK, I know they speak about engaged phenomenology for describing a similar way of understanding phenomenology. I would like to recur to my own Latin American tradition. They didn't speak about critical phenomenology, but in the history of the philosophy in Latin America, the constant concern was to connect philosophy with the current political affairs in many respects, understand what we are in a very concrete way, and also to develop a cultural development, or a cultural project. So those who were interested first in phenomenology in Mexico and Latin America, they were trying to give account of the historical process of the development of our countries. I will say that. And also, this is a notion that I take not from a phenomenologist, but a philosopher closer to a critical Marxism, which is Adolfo Sanchez Vasquez. Sanchez Vasquez was a Marxist, but he was, I will say, is like, how to say this? The West Marxism, like not the Soviet Union way of understanding Marx, not the other way around. He was very critical of this tradition. And he spoke in his book, The Philosophy of Praxis, of understanding the possibility of understanding the philosophy itself as a reflective praxis. And I like this concept of Sanchez Vasquez, and I would like to reframe what Husserl speaks about when Husserl speaks about Selbstbestimmung, especially in Crisis in this text, how we may understand this Selbstbestimmung as a reflective praxis. And I will say also in this regard that Husserl himself was the founder of this critical phenomenology, since he insisted in use the phenomenology, his transcendental project, in order to give account of what was going on in Europe. I mean, his very historical context, the surroundings of the moment, the epoch he was living on, and how the philosophy may contribute to reflect upon what we are and what we could be from a very historical and concrete perspective, even political perspective. Husserl wasn't that interested in politics until after the war. He was more and more interested in the political movements and projects in Europe. And well, of course, Husserl, perhaps, I mean, he had certain relation with Horkheimer, and also this guy, Arnold Metzger, who was interested in the phenomenology of revolution. And Husserl even makes some interesting like statements regarding capitalism. And he says, oh, we are straight against all that kind of capitalism. Phenomenology is against that way of understanding like humanity, in this letter to Metzger. So what I am trying is to connect this perspective, these discussions in the States, because I how to say, I respect and appreciate very much what they are doing. However, methodologically speaking, I see a little bit not that strong their accounts of phenomenology. I mean, they are not that informed in phenomenology. Their understanding of phenomenology is a little bit weak. They are more interested in like going into the thing themselves, doing something, and in a very engaged way, and following some Merleau-Ponty and some something that sounds phenomenological. And I am more interested in bringing more theoretical informed perspective of what could be a critical phenomenology, following my own phenomenological tradition, especially Husserl, and the possible connections with the critical theory. But the critical theory, I mean the classics of critical theory. I am interested in Marcuse and Horkheimer especially, and also I want to take my own Latin American tradition in the way was received the phenomenology in the early 30s, 50s especially. And well, among all these philosophers, particularly, well, Luis Villoro is important. He was phenomenologist, but also was interested in analytic philosophy and political philosophy, and he was always thinking about how we can embrace and cope the political affairs of our country and our nations in Latin America from the point of view of philosophy, and how the philosophy has a responsibility with our community. So this is the way I understand critical phenomenology, the possibility of critique in this broad sense, even in a Kantian sense, is not far from Kant. The sense of this is I like a quote it's a note of the Critic of Pure Reason, when he says that this is the time of the critique, and the religion and the politicians are not are afraid of critique because they don't want to discuss. They want to be like respected because what they are, and they don't want to have this public discussion. So in the reason, he said, the reason does not respect nothing that is not able to be discussed in a public and free way. So this is the idea also of critique. So this is also the way I think it is possible to connect the transcendental phenomenology to idea of a critical phenomenology, not only connecting or engaging empirical affairs, but also thinking about what we do as phenomenologists with regards to the possible effectuations or empirical practical effectuations of our reflections with regard our condition, community, the affairs, the things that are going on, the world itself. Thanks.
Thank you a lot. Dear colleagues, I think we are working on nearly for 2 hours. Thank you one more time, Dr. Quepons, for the fascinating lecture. And I hope to see you on the next events. Yes, it was a great honor, great pleasure for us to welcome you here. I say here, but where it is this here, in a
exactly.
nowhere.
Georgi, I think this reflection is very, very actual about people who are here, but with their mind and other places.
Where we are.
And I would say that Sosobra is highly actual mood. When I will describe it to our Russian colleagues, I think we can have a certain emotional contact on this.
I think that the Sosobra became a universal feeling. We are all feeling now.
Absolutely.
Like this.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. It will be on YouTube, but I have heard that starting from next week, YouTube is banned in Russia, so it will be in YouTube and in RooTube as well, on the Russian version of YouTube.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Good to know. Well, thank you
to all. Yeah.
Well, thanks. See you soon, hopefully.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Okay.